Forget everything you think you know about global empires. When you picture the world's first superpower, you probably think of Britain, with its vast red lines across the map. But the truth is, Spain once held the world in its hands. In the heart of the 16th century, it was the Spanish crown that raised the banner of the largest empire on earth, an immense power that dwarfed all rivals. For the very first time in human history, a single monarch commanded a truly global empire that stretched from the chilly corners of Europe all the way to Africa, and crucially spanned the entire breadth of the Americas and reached across the Pacific to Asia. Their territories were so vast, so geographically immense, that people began to utter a simple, iconic phrase that perfectly captured this dominance. The sun never sets on the Spanish Empire. And yet, we face a fundamental paradox, one that reveals a terrible secret about how empires truly collapse. The richest empire the world had ever known, sitting on more treasure than had ever been seen, collapsed not from a devastating invasion, but under the sheer suffocating weight of its own wealth. The tragic irony of this financial implosion from 4 centuries ago is why the story still holds such urgency today. We continue to make the same fatal error. We mistake a sudden, easy inflow of money, a windfall, for genuine, lasting wealth. And when that bubble inevitably bursts, the resulting economic crash is always, without exception, brutal. The Spanish experience serves as a clear, historical warning to any nation that relies on plunder over production. And that brings us to the source of their fateful mistake. The Spanish journey into ruin began with a stunning stroke of geographical luck. After Christopher Columbus stumbled into the New World in 1492, Spain struck what appeared to be an infinite jackpot, an untouched treasury. Gold and silver in quantities that no European kingdom could possibly imagine suddenly poured into Spanish hands, intoxicating the crown and the nobility. It began with the brutal yet swift conquest of the Aztec Empire in Mexico in 1521, an audacious move by Hernán Cortés that toppled a magnificent civilization and gave Spain immediate access to vast, rich silver mines, including those at Zacatecas. Just a decade later, Francisco Pizarro's devastating conquest of the Inca Empire in Peru unlocked an even greater prize: the legendary Mountain of Silver at Potosí, a mining complex so prolific and so cruel in its demands that it was grimly known as the Mountain that Eats Men. This single geological feature, Potosí, would go on to feed an unstoppable conveyor belt of treasure ships crossing the Atlantic for well over a century. Between 1500 and 1650, Spain imported an estimated 180,000 tons of silver and 2,000 tons of gold. A figure so staggering, it represents more silver than all of Europe had mined in the previous 1,000 years combined. Now, this new world treasure didn't just enrich Spain, it entirely reshaped global commerce. Spanish power became the central engine of the world economy. From the Spanish ports of Seville and Cadiz, ships sailed east, carrying this critical bullion to the Mediterranean and north to the crucial trading centers of the Low Countries. But the reach extended even further. Spanish galleons, laden with silver, sailed west across the Pacific to Manila, a crucial hub where the American silver was traded directly for luxurious Chinese silk, exotic spices, and exquisite porcelain, completing the first truly continuous global trade loop. This massive two-ocean flow of currency was nothing less than the birth of the first truly global economy. And for a powerful, fleeting moment, Spain sat, unchallenged, at its very center. For a modern observer, here is the striking historical reality. When Jamestown, the first permanent English colony, was struggling to survive in a mosquito-ridden swamp in 1607, Mexico City already boasted universities, printing presses, and grand cathedrals. Lima was a thriving metropolis of the viceroyalty, and the Spanish settlement of St. Augustine in Florida, established back in 1565, holds the distinction of being the first permanent European outpost in what is now the United States. Founded a full 4 decades before the English arrived, Spain was building sophisticated global infrastructure while its northern European rivals were still fumbling with failed colonial starts. So, the central question remains: how could an empire fueled by such rivers of bullion ultimately fail? The core problem was that Spain confused the physical treasure with the abstract concept of wealth. The silver bars were undeniably real, but what the crown and the populace did with that silver turned a colossal geographical and financial advantage into a terminal weakness. The immediate disaster was hyperinflation. Between 1500 and 1600, as the bullion poured in, prices across Spain quadrupled. This led to a profound crisis. Ordinary Spaniards found basic goods like bread and clothing impossibly expensive, even as their nation sat on literal mountains of unspent silver. The simple economic mechanism at play is deeply important. Money only holds value when it is scarce enough to maintain trust. When too much bullion suddenly floods an economy, its purchasing power inevitably collapses. This phenomenon is known as the price revolution, the first great wave of global inflation, directly triggered by far too much silver chasing a fixed number of domestic goods. What made the impact so destructive was the fact that this inflation was profoundly uneven. Elites who handled the silver first, the nobles, the major merchants, and foreign bankers, benefited handsomely from the influx before prices could fully adjust across the board, a process economists refer to as the Cantillon effect. In stark contrast, ordinary people, locked into fixed wages or incomes, were utterly decimated and left behind. The profound irony was agonizing. The more silver Spain imported, the poorer its own working people felt. The bullion that was supposed to be the ultimate blessing became a corrosive economic poison. This internal corrosion was compounded by external dependence. The mistakes only ran deeper because the crown, rather than investing its fortune into productive domestic industries, simply burned its silver on imports. Italian merchants, Dutch traders, and German craftsmen all grew incredibly rich, selling manufactured goods and luxuries to Spain, all paid for with that easy American silver. The empire's own nascent industries, such as vital wool production and essential shipbuilding, atrophied and died under this import dependency. The ruling mentality became fatally passive. Why bother building factories or establishing complex, risky trade networks when you could simply wait for the next treasure fleet to arrive? Spain transitioned into being the world's greatest consumer, not a producer. While its northern rivals, England and the Dutch Republic, took the silver they earned or plundered and relentlessly reinvested every coin into developing their own productive capacity and financial sophistication. And tragically, the Spanish monarchs funneled staggering amounts of money into ceaseless, expensive religious and geopolitical wars. The ruling Habsburg dynasty saw itself not just as a kingdom, but as the supreme defender of the Catholic faith after the Protestant Reformation. And that mission carried an astronomical, fatal price tag. Treasure from Mexico and Peru funded campaigns against the powerful Ottoman Turks in the Mediterranean, paid the mercenaries necessary for the brutal suppression of the long-running Dutch revolt for independence, and kept Spain disastrously entangled in the French wars of religion. Moreover, the crown poured massive amounts of capital into the protracted 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, one of the most destructive conflicts Europe had ever witnessed, consuming Spanish treasure at a terrifying, unsustainable pace. Even the single infamous failure of the Spanish Armada of 1588, the colossal fleet sent to crush Protestant England, cost millions of ducats, the equivalent of billions today. And when it failed, the loss was not just military. The financial shock to the crown was devastating and immediate, forcing desperate borrowing. So, Where did all the gold and silver ultimately go? Not into prosperity, but straight into battlefields, colossal ships, and, most destructively, into mountains of debt. Here is the key financial frailty. Spain wasn't just spending the treasure that arrived. They were routinely borrowing staggering amounts against treasure that hadn't even landed yet. German banking families like the powerful Fuggers and later wealthy Genoese financiers advanced enormous loans to the Spanish crown, secured only by the promise of future silver shipments. The theory was intoxicating. The endless silver from Potosí would keep the money flowing forever. But in practice, this reliance on future money was suicidal. If a treasure fleet was delayed, wrecked in a storm, or, worst of all, intercepted by an enemy at sea, Spain had no reserve to cover its obligations, and the crown simply defaulted. And default it did, repeatedly, with 4 state bankruptcies declared in the 16th century alone: 1557, 1575, 1596, and 1607. Think of the sheer absurdity. The richest empire in the world, sitting on more treasure than any kingdom in history, was still forced to tell its creditors, "We can't pay." This instability was Spain's reality, and the crown's endless borrowing essentially mortgaged the nation's future to foreign creditors, who were the only ones willing to play this high-stakes game. And into this fragile, debt-ridden financial system sailed the privateers. They were far more than just random marauders. They were weapons of sophisticated economic warfare, employed by rival states. England and the Netherlands brilliantly understood that if you struck the Spanish treasure fleets, you weren't merely stealing bullion, you were strategically and completely collapsing Spain's sovereign credit. Francis Drake, operating with the express backing of Queen Elizabeth, notoriously plundered Spanish galleons throughout the 1580s, returning home with treasure that totaled half of England's entire annual revenue. Even more decisively, the Dutch privateer Piet Hein captured an entire Spanish treasure fleet off Cuba in 1628, a single, devastating haul worth 11 million guilders. That single maritime strike did more than just steal silver. It was so catastrophic that it wrecked Spain's credit across Europe, collapsing confidence and nearly toppling its finances entirely. The mechanism of collapse was horrifyingly efficient. Every time a fleet was lost, it wasn't merely a bad day at sea for the Spanish Navy, it was a sovereign default in real time. Spain had already mortgaged tomorrow's treasure, and when storms or privateers claimed it, the bankers and creditors across Europe were left unpaid. Meanwhile, the rivals, England and the Netherlands, took the silver they plundered and relentlessly reinvested it into stronger navies, sophisticated banks, and powerful chartered trade companies, which became the true foundations of their own future global empires. Spain's lifeline of easily extractable silver had been tragically weaponized and turned into its absolute Achilles heel. The contrast in economic philosophy is what ultimately decided the outcome. Spain's rulers could have used that flood of bullion to build a modern, diversified, and sustainable economy. They could have subsidized local industries, encouraged technological innovation, and created a tax system that fairly and efficiently captured wealth across all sections of society. Instead, they adopted the mindset that the silver was an endless fountain, leading the crown directly into the most destructive trap of all: debt addiction and structural dependency. This crucial difference reveals the deeper game of history. Spain measured wealth in treasure. Britain and the Dutch measured wealth in systems. One system is finite and easily plundered. The other is self-replicating and enduring. History clearly shows which one wins in the long run. By the mid-1600s, Spain was visibly a fading giant. The Dutch Republic had gained independence, and Britain's navy and financial systems were growing stronger with every passing decade. Spain still held vast territory, but it utterly lacked the financial and productive muscle necessary to defend or develop it. The story of Spain's fall is not just a tale of kings, silver, or pirates. It is a timeless lesson about the illusion of wealth. When floods of money arrive, whether from mines, easy credit, or modern monetary policies, the temptation is identical. Spend it immediately, borrow against it aggressively, and burn it on luxuries or geopolitical wars. But without discipline and without true, sustained investment in real productivity, that money corrodes the very foundations of society. The Spanish peasants knew this better than anyone. They watched silver pour into Seville, only to see bread prices soar beyond their reach. Today, savers watch inflation eat away at their wages, even as governments assure them the economy is robust. The historical mechanisms may have changed, but the economic pain feels hauntingly familiar. Furthermore, Spain's treasure fleets were vulnerable because they concentrated vast wealth into single, colossal shipments. Today, our global economy concentrates wealth into fragile financial systems. Too big to fail banks and complex debt markets balanced on razor-thin confidence. When one critical bank collapses, or one massive debt market seizes up, the shock ripples outward across the globe, just as a pirate raid on a Spanish fleet once triggered sovereign default. The lesson from the 16th century is brutal but necessary. Treasure is not wealth. Silver is not security. Real, enduring wealth comes only from complex systems that produce continuous value over time, from genuine investments in national productivity, and from institutions that foster stability and innovation. Spain bankrupted itself because it tragically thought the ownership of half the world and endless silver guaranteed power forever. In reality, it meant catastrophic fragility. Its rivals understood the deeper game, and it was they who inherited the future. History never perfectly repeats itself, but its fundamental rhythms and warnings are impossible to ignore. The richest empire in the world collapsed because it confused treasure for wealth, and every society that makes the same mistake, flooding its economy with money while hollowing out its productive foundations, is walking the exact same path. The question isn't whether history will repeat. It's whether we, today, will recognize the warning in time. If this deep dive into history gave you a new perspective on modern finance and global power, hit subscribe right now. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look. This captivating historical animation is designed to make the past both engaging and entertaining, and all content is based on the meticulous research of respected historians, with references always provided on screen. Please take a moment to like, comment, and share this video, as your engagement helps us tremendously. Stay tuned for the next chapter in global history.